February 9th, 1944, minus 22 degrees Celsius, the frozen marshlands east of the Oder River, somewhere inside Soviet-held territory. A man lies in snow-covered scrub brush, not moving. His flight suit is soaked through with blood from his right leg. The leg bends at an angle. Legs do not bend. Around him, at roughly 500 meters, Soviet infantry are moving through the tree line, searching. He can hear them. He has been here for hours. His name is Hans-Ulrich Rudel. At this moment, he is the most decorated soldier in the German military. He has flown more combat missions than any pilot alive, on either side of this war, or any war. He has destroyed more enemy tanks, more enemy vehicles, more enemy ships than any pilot in history. He is 30 years old. He is also, without question, a fanatical servant of Adolf Hitler's murderous regime. He believes in it completely. He has never wavered. Here, bleeding into Soviet snow, he is going to make a decision. He is going to decide to live. He is going to decide to fly again. And that decision, the stubbornness of it, the almost inhuman refusal to stop, is going to force us to ask a question that has no comfortable answer. What do we do with a man like this? What do we do when the greatest combat pilot in the history of aviation, a man whose physical courage is almost beyond comprehension, whose skill was acknowledged even by his enemies, whose loyalty to his men was genuine and fierce, what do we do when that man spent every last drop of that courage in the service of history's most documented evil? This is not a story about a hero, but it is a story about heroism, what it is, what it costs, and what happens when extraordinary human capability is placed entirely in the hands of a criminal cause. This is the story of Hans-Ulrich Rudel. Before we begin, this channel does not deal in simple heroes or easy villains. It deals in history, as it was, complicated, uncomfortable, and real. If you value serious, unvarnished war documentaries that trust the audience to think for themselves, I invite you to subscribe. And if you're watching on your television, simply press the up button on your remote and select subscribe. There are many more stories like this, and they deserve careful telling. Now, February 9th, 1944. He nearly didn't make it. That's the first thing that gets lost in the mythology. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, born January 2nd, 1916, in Konradswaldau, Silesia, son of a Lutheran pastor, was by most early assessments an average young man with above-average ambition and strictly average talent. When he entered Luftwaffe flight training in 1936, his instructors were not impressed. He struggled with instrument approaches. His aerobatics were mechanical. He drank no alcohol, ate no meat, kept himself in extraordinary physical condition, the fitness regime of a monk, his classmates thought. But in the cockpit, he was unremarkable. His early assessment reports used words like acceptable and satisfactory, not the vocabulary of legends. His instructors were also noting something else, something harder to quantify but easier to recognize in retrospect. Rudel was ideologically ferocious, in a way that went beyond standard Luftwaffe patriotism. He had grown up in the early years of the Nazi movement, and he had absorbed it completely, not as political calculation, but as genuine faith. Hitler's Germany was not just his country, it was his religion. His instructor at Graz noted in 1937 that Rudel was enthusiastic to a degree that sometimes impairs judgment. He was assigned to reconnaissance units initially. His flying was too pedestrian for fighter aircraft, and he spent the early years of the war in secondary roles. Frustrated, flying Heinkel He-70s on photo missions while his classmates were earning medals over France and Britain. By the time Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, Rudel was a 25-year-old Oberleutnant with almost no combat experience and a fierce, grinding hunger to prove something. He would be assigned to I Group, Stuka Geschwader 2 Immelmann. He would fly the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. The Stuka's reputation in 1941 was already beginning to fray. The aircraft that had terrified Poland and France The gull-winged dive bomber with its screaming Jericho trumpets had been massacred over Britain in 1940. The Royal Air Force's Hurricanes and Spitfires had killed Stukas so efficiently that the entire force had been withdrawn from the Battle of Britain in August, the aircraft proving too slow, too fragile, and too poorly defended against modern fighters. But on the Eastern Front, things were different. The Soviet Air Force of 1941 was in chaos, decimated by the opening Luftwaffe strikes, its command structure shattered, its pilots flying obsolete aircraft in uncoordinated defense. Over the Soviet Union, the Stuka could still operate in the role it was designed for, precision destruction of ground targets, flying low and slow in a near-vertical dive, placing bombs with an accuracy that level-flight bombers could not approach. Rudel flew his first Eastern Front combat mission in June 1941, then another, and another. Something was happening in the cockpit that hadn't happened in training or reconnaissance work. The flying clicked. The mechanical competence that his instructors had rated merely acceptable was under combat conditions, becoming something else entirely. He had a gift, it turned out, for the specific violence of dive bombing, the focus, the nerve, the willingness to hold the dive a fraction of a second longer than the fear said to pull up, buying accuracy with danger. In his first 4 months on the Eastern Front, he flew over 400 missions. The number seems impossible. It was not. On the Eastern Front, Stuka pilots flew multiple sorties per day. The distances were short, the turnarounds fast, the tempo relentless. Rudel was flying 4, sometimes 5 missions in a single day. He was becoming, through sheer repetition, something extraordinary. A man who had been mediocre through training was being forged into an expert by doing the thing itself, over and over, at the highest possible intensity. And then came Kronstadt. September 23, 1941. The Kronstadt naval base on Kotlin Island in the Gulf of Finland, 29 kilometers west of Leningrad. The Soviet Baltic Fleet anchors there, and among those anchored warships, the pride of Soviet naval power, the battleship Marat. The Marat was a formidable target, 23,000 tons of steel, heavily armored, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, whose gunners could see the Stukas coming from kilometers away. Previous Luftwaffe attacks on Kronstadt had achieved nothing against her. The Soviets had deployed barrage balloons, layered AA coverage, smoke generators. The Marat was supposed to be untouchable. Rudel had thought about this. The standard Stuka dive bomb approach, releasing at perhaps 700 meters altitude to avoid the worst of the flak, wasn't going to penetrate the Marat's deck armor with a standard 500 kilograms bomb. The angles weren't steep enough. The velocity wasn't high enough. What Rudel proposed to his Group A commander was essentially this. He would carry a single 1,000-kilogram bomb, the heaviest ordnance that Ju-87 could be configured to carry, and he would dive not to 700 meters, but to 300 meters before release. He would hold the dive deep into the anti-aircraft fire. The bomb's velocity at that angle, from that height, would be sufficient to penetrate the Marat's deck armor. The math was correct. The plan was also, in practical terms, suicidal. At 300 meters over a capital ship, with full anti-aircraft armament, the probability of the aircraft surviving long enough to pull out of the dive was close to zero. Rudel wrote about this moment in his memoir. He noted the risk, clinically. He also noted that he had volunteered for it. At approximately 9:15 in the morning of September 23, 1941, Oberleutnant Hans-Ulrich Rudel rolled his Ju-87 inverted over Kronstadt and pushed the nose down toward the Marat. The anti-aircraft fire was, by his own description, so thick it seemed solid, tracers from dozens of weapons, the ship growing in his gun sight. 1,500 meters, 1,000 meters, 700 meters he had not released. Every instinct said release. He did not release. 300 meters, he released. The 1,000-kilogram bomb struck the Marat forward of the first turret. It penetrated the deck and detonated in the forward magazine. The Marat's bow section disintegrated. The explosion was visible from the shore of Leningrad, 30 kilometers away. The Marat settled to the bottom of the harbor in minutes, taking the forward section of her hull with her. 326 Soviet sailors died in the explosion. Hans-Ulrich Rudel had sunk a battleship, alone, with one bomb. It remains to this day the only recorded instance of a single aircraft, flown by a single pilot, sinking a capital warship with a single weapon in World War II. Rudel was awarded the Knight's Cross. He was 25 years old. He had found what he was, the question of what it meant to be that thing. He would not ask it for another 4 years, and even then he would refuse to answer. There is a phrase that appears in military histories of the Eastern Front with uncomfortable frequency: a traditional excellence. It means the systematic grinding, professional destruction of human beings and their equipment at a scale and duration that becomes almost industrial in character. By 1942, Hans-Ulrich Rudel was attritional excellence personified. He was flying, by this point, the Junkers Ju-87D, the upgraded Dora variant, with a more powerful Jumo 211J engine and improved aerodynamics. He was flying in the same conditions that were killing thousands of less experienced pilots: the flat-light whiteouts of Russian winter, the dust storms of Ukrainian summer that chewed engine components to scrap, the instrument failures in temperature extremes no manufacturer had designed for, the Soviet fighter defenses that had improved enormously from the shattered force of 1941. Rudel didn't just survive these conditions, he mastered them. He developed techniques for low-altitude escape from fighter attack, using the Stuka's slower speed as an advantage in turning engagements, forcing Soviet fighters to overshoot, then using terrain for cover. He became a specialist in reading tank formations from altitude, identifying the command vehicles, calculating where to attack to create the maximum disruption. He flew with a rear gunner, always, and he demanded from his gunners an alertness and accuracy that most crews found exhausting. Several of his gunners were wounded or killed in the missions he survived. His kill tallies were climbing at a rate that headquarters found difficult to process. 100 tanks, 150, 200. The numbers required verification by multiple witnesses, and they held up under scrutiny. Rudel had become what combat aviation occasionally produces and what training almost never predicts: a natural killer. Not of any particular temperament, he was controlled, almost cold, in the aircraft, but of capability. In 1943, the Stuka evolved one more time into its final and most lethal form, the Ju-87G, the cannon bird. The concept was straightforward in theory and devastating in practice. Remove the conventional bomb load. Mount 237 MMBK-3, 7 anti-tank cannon pods under the wings, each containing a single-barreled Flak 18 gun. The resulting aircraft could engage Soviet tanks from above and behind, their most vulnerable angles, with armor-piercing shells that could defeat the roof armor of most Soviet armor in service. The trade-offs were severe. The cannon pods destroyed the Ju-87's already marginal performance. The Kanonenvogel was slower, heavier, less maneuverable. A Ju-87G without fighter escort over Soviet territory was a flying target. Experienced Soviet pilots knew exactly what the aircraft was and what it meant. The presence of the tank killers meant the Germans were desperate to stop an armored advance. They hunted the Kanonenvogel specifically. Soviet after-action reports from the Kursk period in July 1943 contain specific references to priority destruction of the twin-cannon Stuka. The Soviets understood that taking out a single, experienced anti-tank pilot could save dozens of tanks. Rudel was being hunted by name by this point. Soviet intelligence had identified him from captured documents and prisoner interrogations. His aircraft markings were known. His tactics were studied. Krista Bergstrom's detailed research into the air battles over Kursk documents at least 2 confirmed engagements in the summer of 1943, in which Rudel's aircraft was damaged by Soviet fighters and forced to return to base. In one of these, a Soviet LaGG 3 pilot named Alexander Krivets reported closing to within 150 meters before his guns jammed. Rudel landed with significant battle damage. Krivitz claimed the engagement as a probable kill. Rudel flew again the next morning. By late 1943, Rudel's mission count was approaching 2,000. The number of tanks he had destroyed was over 300. His physical constitution, the monkish regimen he had maintained since youth, no alcohol, no tobacco, daily physical training, was sustaining a pace that was killing men half his commitment level. He had been wounded multiple times, always returning to duty. He had lost gunners. He had seen his entire group rotate through losses that, if tabulated, represented the death of most of the men he had originally flown with. He did not appear to be processing this in a way that most human beings would recognize. His memoir, written 8 years later, does not contain much reflection about loss. It contains a great deal of description of tactical problems and their solutions. It contains genuine affection for his men, expressed in the language of a commander who respects competence and values loyalty. It contains, notably, almost nothing about the human beings on the ground he was killing. The tank crews burning in Soviet armor, the artillery teams destroyed by his cannon fire, the supply columns he strafed on return legs when ammunition remained. This is not unusual in combat memoirs, to be fair. Most pilots described their work in mechanical terms. The distance of altitude and speed permits a kind of abstraction that ground warfare does not. But in Rudel's memoir, the abstraction is total. There are no cracks, no moments where the weight of what he was doing seems to land on him. When he described what drove him, it was always the same. Duty, Germany, the Führer, the men beside him, the mission, always the mission. And the mission, in the winter of 1944, was about to bring him to the worst day of his life. February 9th, 1944. The temperature at Rudel's base that morning was minus 24 degrees Celsius. He was now an Oberstleutnant, lieutenant colonel, commanding 3 Gruppe Stuka Geschwader, 2 Immelmann. He had over 2,100 combat missions to his name. He had just been awarded the Swords to his Knight's Cross, one of the rarest decorations in the German military. He was, by every formal measure, Germany's most successful combat aviator. The mission that morning was a tank-hunting sortie along the Oder River front, where Soviet armored units were pressing hard against German defensive positions. The briefing was standard. Identify and destroy Soviet armor. Prioritize T-34s threatening German infantry positions. Return to base. This was the mission. This was always the mission now. Rudel flew with his regular formation, his wingman Feldwebel Ernst Gademann at his right quarter. Gademann was more than a wingman. He was a physician, a qualified doctor who had volunteered for the Luftwaffe, who had been flying with Rudel long enough to read him the way doctors read patients. Gademann watched Rudel the way someone watches a person they are quietly worried about. Professionally, carefully, they found the Soviet armor. They began their attack runs. Rudel, in his account, describes the first passes as clean. Soviet tanks identified, engaged, destroyed. The second element of the sortie was continuing when the Soviet anti-aircraft opened up with more intensity than expected. The Soviet ground forces had adapted. By 1944, they knew where the tank killers would go, wherever their tanks were threatened, and they were positioning dedicated anti-aircraft units in the path of anticipated attack corridors. The 37mm and 88mm batteries were pre-registered on approach angles. The Soviet gunners were good. They had been good for some time. They had been specifically, methodically, trying to kill Hans-Ulrich Rudel for months. Over the Oder River, approximately 40 kilometers east of Breslau, they succeeded. A burst of Soviet 37mm fire, possibly more than one gun firing simultaneously, struck Rudel's Ju-87G in the engine and cockpit area. The details in his memoir are specific. He felt the aircraft shudder, saw the oil pressure drop to 0, felt the rudder pedal cease responding. The Jumo engine, already struggling in the cold, was dying. He had altitude, perhaps 800 meters, and he had speed bleeding off fast, and he had Soviet territory in every direction. He had been shot down before. 29 times before this, in fact, by his own late account, though many of those were forced landings from minor damage rather than true shoot-downs. He knew the procedure. He found a flat area east of the river. He put the aircraft down. The landing was not survivable by standard analysis. The terrain was frozen farmland interrupted by drainage ditches, and Rudel hit one. The Ju-87G came to rest on its nose with the tail in the air. His rear gunner, Henschel, was injured but mobile. Rudel himself stepped out of the wreckage and immediately realized his right leg was worse than it felt. There was blood. There was damage to the leg that the cold was partly masking. But there was no time to assess it. Soviet infantry were already moving toward the crash site. What followed over the next several hours is documented in Rudel's memoir, in a passage that is whatever one thinks of the man and his politics. Genuinely extraordinary in its specificity and its strange flatness of tone, he and Henschel moved away from the wreck through frozen marsh and scrub. Rudel's leg was deteriorating. He could still walk, but the mechanics of it were becoming wrong in ways he was trying not to examine. The temperature was still -20. Soviet infantry were tracking them by their footprints in the snow. They moved parallel to the river, looking for any gap in the Soviet perimeter. Rudel describes making decisions during this movement in the language of a man who is calculating without panic, where to cross open ground, where the trees provided cover, when to move, and when to stop. The leg is mentioned periodically, almost as an inconvenience. Over the radio, he had grabbed his survival transmitter from the wreck. He had made contact with Gardermann. Ernst Gardermann's account of what happened next was described in a 1975 West German television interview. He had heard Rudel's transmission. He had calculated the rough location. He had understood that Rudel was behind Soviet lines, injured, and that the Soviet infantry were closing in. He had made a decision that, in the strict calculus of military aviation, no reasonable person could require of him. He landed, not at an airfield, not on prepared ground, on a frozen field east of the Oder River, in Soviet-controlled territory, under fire, in a single-engine aircraft with no room for error. He found a stretch of frozen ground long enough to attempt a landing, put his Stuka down, and taxied toward where Rudel's radio signal was coming from. Rudel and Henschel reached the aircraft under Soviet small arms fire. Gardermann, who had no weapon and no defense, held his aircraft on the ground and waited. They got in, both of them, crammed into the rear gunner's position in conditions of extraordinary physical difficulty, and Gardermann took off. The field was short. The aircraft was overloaded. Soviet fire was continuing. Gardermann's account in the 1975 interview is characteristically understated. He described the takeoff as difficult. The German word he used was schwierig, which can mean anything from challenging to nearly impossible. He smiled slightly when he said it. Rudel reached the German side of the Oder. He was taken immediately to a field surgical unit. There, the full extent of the damage to his right leg was assessed. The crash and the subsequent hours of movement through frozen terrain had destroyed blood supply to the lower leg. The surgeons had no choice. The right leg below the knee was amputated. Rudel was told he would not fly again. He was told this, according to his own account, by a military surgeon who was attempting to be gentle about it. A man who had flown 2,103 combat missions, who had never stopped, who had defined himself entirely through the act of flying and fighting, that man was now being told it was over. What Rudel felt in that moment is, characteristically, not described in his memoir with any real emotional depth. He writes that he rejected this assessment. He writes that he would return to the aircraft. But somewhere in the silence between what the memoir says and what it doesn't, in the long hours in that field hospital, in the weeks of recovery that followed, something is happening that the memoir refuses to show us. A man who had survived 2,103 missions and 30 shoot-downs and everything the Eastern Front could do to a human body was now confronted, for the first time, with a question his ideology had no answer for. What do you do when the thing you are has been taken from you? For Rudel, the answer was the same as it had always been. You refuse the premise. You get back in the aircraft. He began exercising in his hospital bed. Physical therapy was not yet a concept the German military hospital system had fully developed, but Rudel didn't need a concept. He needed to know whether the remaining musculature of his right leg could engage the modified rudder pedal. His mechanics were already, at his direction, fabricating. He needed to know whether the prosthetic, a below-knee design fitted within weeks of the amputation, could be made to function in a cockpit environment. His mechanics told him they could modify the WWII controls. His Group A commander told him the decision would have to come from higher. Rudel went higher. The requests propagated up through the Luftwaffe command structure with his name on them, and his name carried enough weight by February 1944 that the requests did not simply disappear. He was certified to fly again in approximately 6 weeks after the amputation. 6 weeks, from the removal of a limb to resuming combat operations on the Eastern Front. Gademan, in that 1975 interview, was asked about this, about what it was like to watch Rudel return. He paused. He said, "You had to admire it. You didn't have any other word for it. Whatever else you might say, and there are things to say, you had to admire it." Gademan, who had risked his life to save Rudel's, who had watched this man for years with a doctor's careful attention, chose, after the war, to say almost nothing about Hans-Ulrich Rudel's politics. Not in that interview, not in any public forum. He became a physician in West Germany, a respected one, and he did not speak about the man he had saved in Soviet snow. The silence is its own kind of testimony. Make of it what you will. He was back in a cockpit in April 1944, 47 days after the amputation. There is no genteel way to describe what Rudel flying on a prosthetic leg actually meant in practical terms. The right rudder pedal required pressure to coordinate turns. The prosthetic had been fitted with a modified boot that could engage the pedal, but the feedback through the artificial limb was different, necessarily, from flesh and bone. He had to fly differently. He had to relearn coordination that was, for most pilots, below conscious thought. He did it. His first post-amputation missions were observed carefully by his mechanics and by Gademan. The aircraft responded. The shooting was accurate. The tanks burned. In late 1944, as the German front continued its long collapse eastward, Rudel's war became something that defies easy categorization. The missions were still happening. He was flying more days than not, continuing to add to his kill tallies, his 400th tank, his 450th, numbers that Soviet armor planners were tracking with considerable interest in their own after-action analyses. Soviet Air Force commanders specifically requested intercept priority for Rudel's aircraft in sector orders recovered from archives. But something else was happening. Germany was losing, visibly, undeniably, catastrophically losing. The cities were burning. The armies were retreating. The Luftwaffe that Rudel had entered as a young cadet, one of the most powerful air forces in the world, was now flying on fuel shortages and replacement pilots who had 40 hours total time. Rudel's response to this was not what history has sometimes portrayed as the natural response of a man seeing reality. Doubt, disillusionment, the slow loosening of ideology's grip. His response was intensification. His speeches to his group in the last months of the war, as described by surviving pilots, were not the speeches of a man moderating his beliefs in the face of evidence. They were the speeches of a man whose faith was hardening, because faith is what remains when the facts have all turned against you. He demanded more from his men as Germany crumbled. He spoke about sacrifice, about ultimate victory, about the Führer's vision. The men who flew with him, many of them younger, many of them with far less reason for this faith, listened because he was Rudel, because he had the decorations and the kill tallies and the prosthetic leg, and because when a man like that speaks, even at the edge of catastrophe, human beings tend to listen. He was shot down again in February 1945. His prosthetic leg was damaged. He flew the next day. The last combat mission flown by Hans-Ulrich Rudel took place on the morning of May 8, 1945. This is documented. Germany's unconditional surrender was signed in the early hours of that day. Rudel flew anyway. He attacked Soviet armor that was advancing on German positions. He returned to his base. He then flew his unit westward, over the lines, into American-controlled territory, deliberately surrendering to the United States Army, rather than the Soviet forces he had been fighting for nearly 4 years. 2,530 total combat missions. The number is confirmed by Luftwaffe records. No pilot in any air force in any war in recorded history has flown more. Not before, not since. 519 Soviet tanks destroyed, confirmed by official records and independent verification. 70 landing craft, 150 gun emplacements, hundreds of trucks and vehicles. The Marat, 30 aerial victories. The single Knight's Cross with golden oak leaves, swords and diamonds ever awarded. The highest military decoration Germany had, given to exactly one human being in the entire war. And on May 8, 1945, the morning after Germany surrendered, the most decorated soldier of that war flew his last combat mission and then landed in American hands. The American officers who received him described his demeanor as calm and correct. He was, by their accounts, not visibly distressed. He thanked them for their courtesy. He was a prisoner of war for several months, released through American custody in late 1945. He showed no sign, to anyone who interacted with him in this period, of doubting anything. In 1948, Hans-Ulrich Rudel left Germany. He went to Argentina. This was not coincidence, and it was not simply the attraction of a warm climate. Argentina under Juan Perón had become, in the late 1940s, a deliberate sanctuary for Nazi exiles, a network documented meticulously by journalist Uki Gonyi in his 2002 work, The Real Odessa. The escape routes, the facilitators, the Argentine officials who processed the documentation. This was infrastructure, not accident. Rudel traveled through it, knowingly, arriving in Buenos Aires as part of a community that included war criminals, former SS officers, and ideological dead-enders of every stripe. He knew Otto Skorzeny, the SS commando who had rescued Mussolini. He was connected to other exiles. He was active in the early 1950s in organizations that were not subtle about what they were, successor movements to the political ideology that had just killed 50 million people. In 1952, he published Stuka Pilot in German, then in English translation. It became a bestseller in West Germany, where a significant portion of the population was, in 1952, still quite interested in reading an unambiguous account of German military excellence, with no moral qualification attached. Reading Stuka Pilot today is a disorienting experience. It is, in many respects, a very good book. The combat descriptions are visceral and specific. The tactical analysis is sophisticated. The account of the February 9th shoot-down and recovery is gripping in exactly the way it should be. Rudel writes well. He thinks clearly about military problems. And there is almost nothing in the book, across 300-plus pages of extraordinary events, that reflects on what any of it meant. The Soviet soldiers whose tanks he destroyed are the enemy. The villages burning below are operational context. The ideology for which all of it was done is barely mentioned at all, because from Rudel's perspective, it requires no mention. It is simply the water he swam in, so fundamental it doesn't need description. There are no dead civilians in the book. There are no moral doubts. There is no chapter where Rudel considers whether the cause was worth the cost. This absence is the book's most important content. He returned to West Germany in the 1950s and became involved in far-right politics directly, connected to the Sozialistische Reichspartei and its successor organizations. Organizations whose goal was the rehabilitation of National Socialism as a legitimate political tradition. He was not peripheral to this world. He was a figurehead. His name, his decorations, his record gave credibility to people who had considerably less. He was invited to speak. He spoke. He said what he believed. He believed, until his death, that Adolf Hitler had been a great leader whose main error had been the failure to win the war. He died on December 18, 1982, in Rosenheim, Bavaria. He was 66 years old. His funeral drew former Luftwaffe veterans, right-wing political figures, and, in the detail that caused a political scandal in West Germany in early 1983, serving officers of the Bundeswehr in uniform. The German army sent representatives in uniform to the funeral of a man who had spent his post-war life working to rehabilitate the ideology the Bundeswehr was explicitly founded in opposition to. The Bundestag debated it. Der Spiegel covered it. The Bundeswehr officers were disciplined. The debate was genuine and heated, and it revolved around the same question that still has no clean answer. How do you separate the soldier from the cause? How do you honor the service without honoring what it served? No one resolved it. Former Soviet veterans who had faced Rudel's aircraft were, in the post-war years, asked about him in the occasional joint reunions and historical conferences of the glasnost and post-Soviet period. Their answers were, in a way, more honest than the German debate. One Soviet tank commander, speaking through an interpreter at a 1991 conference in Moscow, was asked whether he respected Rudel. He said, "I feared his aircraft. I knew what it meant when the tank killers were above us." He paused. Respect is a different question. That is, perhaps, the most precise thing anyone ever said about Hans-Ulrich Rudel. Fear his aircraft. Know what he could do. Separate that, as cleanly as you can, from what he was. The question is whether that separation is actually possible, whether honoring the capability requires, even partially, honoring the cause it served, whether the sheer quantity of his achievement, 2,530 missions, 519 tanks, one battleship, a prosthetic leg in a combat cockpit, pulls us toward something that we should resist being pulled toward. Here is the honest version of this question, aimed directly at American audiences. If Hans-Ulrich Rudel had been born in Ohio instead of Silesia, if he had flown P-47s instead of Stukas, if he had destroyed German tanks instead of Soviet ones, would we call him the greatest American combat pilot in history? Would there be statues? Would his memoir be required reading at the Air War College? Almost certainly yes. And so the discomfort is not just about Rudel. It is about what we mean when we say heroic. It is about whether courage is a virtue in itself, separate from the question of what it's spent on. It is about whether we believe, as we often implicitly claim to, that how a man fights matters independently of why. Rudel forces the question. He always forced it. He refused, until his last breath, to answer it, because for him there was no question. He served, he flew, he fought, he survived. That was all there was. There is a Ju-87G Stuka in the collection of the RAF Museum at Hendon, outside London. It is one of very few surviving examples of the Cannon-Vogel variant. It sits in its hangar, looking like what it was, a functional, ugly, purpose-built instrument of destruction. There are no glamour lines in its silhouette. It was never fast, never graceful, never what anyone would call beautiful. It was effective. There are no Rudel aircraft specifically preserved, no cockpit with his modifications, no memorial at a German airbase. The formal German military tradition, wisely, does not go there. But Stuka Pilot is still in print, in German and in English. It still sells. And somewhere in that fact, in the ongoing commercial reality of a book written by an unrepentant Nazi that continues to find readers 70 years after it was written, the question remains alive. Remember that February morning over the Oder River, 1944. The man in the snow, bleeding with Soviet infantry closing through the tree line. The man who decided to live. The man who decided, on a prosthetic leg, to keep flying. He kept flying, all the way to May 8th, 1945, the last day of a war that killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million human beings. The last day of a regime that murdered 6 million Jews, that enslaved millions more, that is documented in sufficient detail that its nature requires no debate. He flew for that, all of it he flew for that. What do we do with a man like this? We look at him, clearly, without the comfort of easy answers. We acknowledge what he could do, and we name what he served, and we resist the temptation to resolve the tension between those two facts into something simpler than it is. The sky over the Oder, on the morning of February 9th, 1944, was winter white and absolutely cold. Hans-Ulrich Rudel's aircraft fell out of it trailing smoke. He survived. He should not have. He went back up. That is the story. All of it, without exception, is the story. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you understand that history is rarely comfortable. This channel exists to examine war without mythology, to look directly at the record, even when the record resists easy conclusions. If you believe these kinds of conversations matter, I invite you to subscribe. There are many more stories like this, stories that ask difficult questions and trust you to wrestle with them. And if you have thoughts on this one, I'd genuinely like to read them. Respectful disagreement is part of serious history. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next examination.